Winter settled heavily over Boston that afternoon, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and refused to let go. Snow had been falling since morning, thick and steady, coating the sidewalks and muting the city's usual noise. By the time Veronica Hayes climbed the front steps of the apartment building, her black coat was dusted white, her shoes soaked through at the edges. She was 17 years old, and she had just come back from her mother's funeral. Inside the building, the air smelled faintly of old paint and radiator heat. Veronica paused in the hallway before unlocking the door, her gloved hand resting against the wood as if she needed to steady herself. The day felt unreal, as though she were moving through it underwater. She had stood at the cemetery only hours earlier, listening to words that floated past her without meaning, condolences, prayers, phrases about rest and peace that seemed designed for someone else's grief, not hers. When she stepped into the apartment, the silence hit her harder than the cold. The lights were off. The living room looked exactly as it had that morning before they left for the funeral. Eleanor's scarf was still draped over the back of the chair. A half-empty mug sat on the kitchen counter, cold now, untouched. Veronica closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing too loudly in the stillness. She slipped off her shoes and stood there, unsure where to go, unsure what came next. The apartment felt wrong without her mother's presence. It was not just quiet, it was hollow, as if something essential had been removed and the space hadn't yet figured out how to exist without it. Outside, snow pressed against the windows in slow, relentless waves. The sky had already begun to darken, the afternoon fading into early evening. Veronica crossed the living room and touched the radiator beneath the window. It was warm, but she still felt cold deep inside in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. From the kitchen came the sound of a cabinet opening, then closing a little too hard. Victor Hale emerged moments later, his black suit jacket tossed carelessly over one arm, his tie loosened. At the cemetery, he had stood beside Veronica with his head bowed, accepting condolences with quiet nods and practiced restraint. He had looked every bit the grieving husband. Now, in the privacy of the apartment, the mask had slipped. He didn't look at Veronica as he passed her, heading straight for the kitchen counter. She watched him wordlessly as he reached for a bottle of whiskey and poured himself a generous amount into a glass. The sharp smell of alcohol cut through the air. "Long day," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Veronica nodded automatically, though he wasn't watching. Her throat felt tight, her emotions dulled to a distant ache. She had cried earlier, at the graveside briefly when the casket was lowered, but now even tears felt out of reach. Everything inside her was suspended, frozen, as if her mind hadn't yet caught up to the reality of what had happened. Victor took a long drink and winced, irritation flashing across his face. He poured himself another without hesitation. There was no softness in his movements, no sign of the devastation one might expect from a man who had just buried his wife. The unease crept in slowly. Veronica noticed it in the way he exhaled sharply, as though the day had inconvenienced him rather than broken him. In the way he rubbed his temple with impatience instead of grief. In the way the bottle never left his hand. She retreated toward her bedroom, drawn by instinct rather than intention. Inside, the familiar space offered little comfort. On her nightstand sat a framed photo of her and her mother from the previous summer, taken along the Charles River. Eleanor's smile in the picture seemed impossibly distant now, belonging to a life that had ended without warning. A sudden sound of glass against the counter made Veronica flinch. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photograph, and for the first time that day, the truth settled fully in her chest. Her mother was gone. Eleanor Hayes was not coming back. The realization was sharp, cutting through the numbness with painful clarity. Veronica pressed her lips together, breathing slowly, trying to keep herself steady. Somewhere behind her, in the other room, Victor poured another drink. The day was over, but something told Veronica that what waited ahead was far worse than the funeral she had just endured. Evening settled over the apartment, slowly, the way winter nights always did in Boston. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick flakes blurring the streetlights into pale halos. Inside, the kitchen light cast a harsh yellow glow over the counters, illuminating every detail Veronica would later wish she could forget. She hadn't planned to come back into the kitchen. Hunger hadn't crossed her mind all day. But hours had passed since the funeral, and the silence in her room had grown unbearable. When she stepped into the doorway, Victor was standing at the counter with his back to her, the whiskey bottle uncapped beside him. The clock above the microwave read just past 9. Victor didn't turn around when she entered. He took another drink, then set the glass down with deliberate care, as if preparing himself for a conversation he had already rehearsed. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was calm, too calm. Veronica hesitated, then moved farther into the kitchen, stopping a few steps away from the table. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how small she felt in the oversized sweater she had borrowed from her mother months ago. Victor finally turned to face her. His eyes were clear, his expression controlled. Whatever grief he had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "I'll be direct," he said. "I've never been good at pretending for long." Veronica frowned slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "Pretending about what?" Victor exhaled through his nose, almost amused. "About you." The words landed without force at first, like something she didn't quite understand. He continued before she could respond. "I never wanted to raise a child," he said evenly, "especially not one that wasn't mine. I tolerated the situation because your mother insisted. Eleanor had expectations." Her chest tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Victor replied, lifting his glass again, "that the arrangement ended today. With Eleanor." He took a slow sip, watching her over the rim. "I stayed because I loved her. But you were never part of that equation." Veronica felt as though the floor beneath her had shifted. "She was my mother," she said quietly. "Of course I was part of it." Victor shook his head. "You were an obligation, one I honored longer than I should have." There was no shouting, no raised voice. That was what made it worse. Each sentence was delivered with calm precision, stripped of emotion, as though he were explaining a simple fact rather than dismantling her sense of safety. He gestured vaguely around the kitchen. "This apartment belonged to your mother before we married, yes. But I was her husband. I handled the finances. I paid the bills." Veronica's heart began to race. "What does that have to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Victor interrupted, his tone sharpening just slightly. "This place is mine now, and I don't see why you assume you're entitled to stay." The word entitled made her flinch. "I live here," she said, her voice unsteady. "This is my home." Victor's expression hardened. "It was your home because Eleanor allowed it." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Veronica tried to process his words, but they came too fast, piling on top of the grief she hadn't yet managed to face. "I'm still in school," she said, grasping at logic. "I'm 17. Victor's mouth tightened. "Exactly." The way he said it made her stomach drop. "You're not a child anymore," he continued, "but you're not an adult either, which puts you in a very inconvenient position." Fear crept in, slow and unmistakable. "What are you saying?" she asked again, though part of her already knew. Victor set his glass down and folded his arms. "I'm saying you need to make other arrangements." Her breath caught. "Other arrangements. Tonight." He didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved over her face, assessing, detached. Then he nodded once. "Yes." The room seemed to tilt. Veronica took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. I don't have anywhere else to go. That's not my problem, Victor replied. The finality in his voice was unmistakable. In that moment, the reality of her position became terrifyingly clear. She had no income, no car, no immediate family left. She was still legally a minor, standing alone in a kitchen with a man who had just made it clear he felt no obligation toward her. Victor was taller, older, in control of the space, the documents, the money. He knew it, and now so did she. Veronica realized then that the man who had stood beside her at the graveside that morning no longer existed. The mask had come off, and what stood in front of her was not a grieving stepfather, but someone who saw her not as family, but as an obstacle to be removed. The argument did not escalate. There was no shouting, no slammed fists against the counter. That was what made what followed so much worse. Victor glanced toward the hallway, then back at Veronica. Go pack what you need, he said. You have 5 minutes. She stared at him, uncomprehending. 5 minutes for what? To leave. The word landed heavily in the air. Outside, the wind howled against the building, rattling the window panes as another wave of snow swept through the street below. It's snowing, Veronica said, her voice barely above a whisper. There's a storm warning. Victor shrugged. It's February in Boston. That happens. Her heart began to pound. I don't have anywhere to go. You'll figure something out, he replied. You always do. Or Eleanor did it for you. The mention of her mother felt deliberate, calculated. Veronica's hands trembled as she turned and walked down the hallway, her legs moving on instinct while her mind struggled to keep up. In her bedroom, she stood frozen for a moment, staring at the familiar space as though seeing it for the last time. The dresser, the desk by the window, the photo on her nightstand. 5 minutes suddenly felt impossibly short. She grabbed her backpack from the chair and shoved in whatever her hands landed on first. Warm socks, a sweater, her school notebook. She hesitated over the framed photograph, then slipped it into the side pocket, the glass cold against her fingers. From the hallway came the sound of Victor pacing. Hurry up, he called. I don't have all night. Veronica reached for her phone on the nightstand, relief flickering briefly as she imagined calling someone, anyone, but before she could pick it up, Victor appeared in the doorway. Leave that, he said. She looked up at him, confused. I need my phone. No, you don't. Before she could react, he stepped forward and took it from her hand. His grip was firm, final. I'm keeping it, he said. Same with your ID. My ID. Panic surged through her chest. Why? To prevent trouble, Victor replied calmly. You're upset. You might do something stupid. This way, things stay simple. That's not yours, she said, her voice breaking. That's mine. He ignored her protest and reached into the drawer of her desk, retrieving the small envelope where she kept her identification. He slipped it into his jacket pocket alongside her phone. There, he said. Now go. Veronica stood rooted to the floor. You can't do this. Victor's expression hardened. I can't, and I am. The last 5 minutes blurred together. She slung the backpack over her shoulder, her movements clumsy, her hands numb. As she stepped back into the hallway, the apartment already felt distant, as though it were rejecting her before she had even left. Victor walked ahead of her to the front door and opened it. A blast of icy air rushed inside, carrying snowflakes that melted instantly against the warm floor. Out, he said. She paused on the threshold, staring into the dark stairwell beyond. The building was quiet, most of the other residents already settled in for the night, unaware of what was happening just a few feet away. Please, she said softly. Victor did not respond. He waited until she stepped forward, then closed the door behind her without another word. The sound of the lock sliding into place echoed through the stairwell. Veronica stood there, her breath coming out in short, white puffs. The hallway lights flickered faintly overhead. For several seconds she didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind refused to accept what had just happened. She was outside her own home. She tried the handle once, then again. It didn't budge. The reality sank in slowly, painfully. She had no phone, no identification, no money she could reach, just a backpack and the clothes she was wearing. She slid down against the wall, her back pressed to the cold concrete, and wrapped her arms around herself. The stairwell smelled faintly of dust and dampness. Somewhere below, a door slammed as another resident entered the building, their footsteps fading quickly. No one noticed her. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow piled higher against the windows, swallowing the city in white. The streetlights blurred into distant smears of yellow, and the wind howled like a living thing. Veronica stared straight ahead, her thoughts disjointed, her body shaking from cold and shock. In a matter of minutes, she had gone from grieving daughter to something else entirely. She had been made homeless, and the night had only just begun. The stairwell was colder than Veronica expected. After several minutes, pressed against the wall outside the apartment door, she forced herself to stand. Remaining there felt too exposed, too close to what she had just lost. She tightened the straps of her backpack and began to move downward, one step at a time, her sneakers barely making a sound on the concrete stairs. On the floor below, she paused in front of the first apartment door she recognized. A retired couple lived there, people who had nodded politely in the hallway for years. Veronica raised her hand, hesitated, then knocked. Nothing. She waited, listening for movement, for a television, for footsteps. There was only the hum of the building's heating system. She knocked again, softer this time, then stepped back when no answer came. She moved on, one door after another. Some had lights on behind the frosted glass. Others were dark. At one apartment, she thought she heard voices inside, laughter drifting faintly through the door. She lifted her hand, then let it fall. The idea of explaining herself, of saying the words out loud, felt impossible. By the time she reached the ground floor, her fingers were numb, her shoulders aching from tension. The lobby offered no comfort. The front doors rattled under the pressure of the wind, snow blowing sideways outside, piling against the glass in uneven drifts. Leaving the building altogether would mean stepping directly into the storm. She wasn't ready for that. Veronica turned back toward the stairs and climbed upward again. Her steps slower now, heavier. The stairwell felt marginally warmer than the lobby, protected from the worst of the wind. She chose a spot between floors, tucked against the wall where the draft was weakest, and lowered herself onto the concrete steps. She pulled her coat tighter around her body and rested her head against the railing. Her stomach growled sharply, the sound loud in the quiet space. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten. The funeral food, sandwiches, pastries, might as well have belonged to another lifetime. Hunger settled in, dull but persistent. Exhaustion followed close behind, the kind that pressed down on her eyelids and made her limbs feel heavy, unresponsive. Her thoughts began to blur, sliding from one to the next without order. She reached into her backpack, checking its contents by touch. Sweater, notebook, photo. She searched again, more frantically this time, until the truth hit her. The cash, the small envelope she kept hidden in her desk drawer, the money she had saved from tutoring and birthday gifts, was still in her bedroom. Her breath caught as the realization sank in. She had nothing, not even enough for a bus ticket or a vending machine. Her throat tightened, and she pressed her forehead against her knees, fighting the urge to cry. Tears felt dangerous now. She didn't know if she would be able to stop once they started. Instead, memories surfaced uninvited. Her mother standing at the stove on Sunday mornings, humming softly while flipping pancakes. Eleanor brushing snow from Veronica's coat when she came home from school, scolding her gently for forgetting her gloves. The way she always said, "We'll figure it out," no matter how small or large the problem was. The ache in Veronica's chest deepened. "I don't know how," she whispered into the empty stairwell. Time passed without shape or measure. The building grew quieter as the night wore on, the occasional creak of pipes the only reminder that life continued around her. Her body began to shake, partly from cold, partly from the effort of staying awake. At some point, exhaustion won. Her eyes closed without her noticing. Her head tipped sideways, resting against the wall. Sleep came in short, shallow fragments. In one of them, she was standing in her childhood bedroom, sunlight pouring through the window. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, calm and unhurried, as though nothing had ever been wrong. "You're going to be okay," her mother said, smoothing Veronica's hair. "I thought about this. I prepared for it." Veronica tried to ask what she meant, but the words wouldn't come. Eleanor smiled, the way she always did when she knew something Veronica didn't. Then the cold returned. Veronica woke with a sharp inhale, her breath fogging the air in front of her. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the stairwell came back into focus, the concrete, the railing, the dim overhead light. Her dream faded, leaving behind a hollow ache and a strange, fragile sense of reassurance she couldn't explain. She shifted, her joints stiff, and glanced toward the small window at the end of the stairwell. The darkness outside had lightened almost imperceptibly. The snow still fell, but the sky held a faint gray tint now, the first hint of morning. Dawn was approaching. Veronica pulled her coat tighter and stared at the steps below her. The night had passed, but nothing had changed. She still had no plan, no shelter, no way forward she could see. As the city slowly woke beyond the walls of the building, Veronica remained where she was, cold, hungry, and alone, waiting for an answer that had yet to arrive. Morning arrived, quietly, without ceremony. The storm had finally begun to loosen its grip on the city, leaving behind a thick, uneven blanket of snow that dulled every sound. Boston looked muted and pale in the early light, as though the night had drained the color from it. The sky was a flat, exhausted gray. Veronica Hayes stood near the entrance of the building, her backpack at her feet, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She hadn't gone far after dawn. The cold outside was sharper than the stairwell, and she hadn't been ready to face it for long. Instead, she lingered just inside the doorway, close enough to see the street, close enough to leave if she had to. Her body ached with fatigue. Hunger sat heavy in her stomach, no longer sharp but constant, draining her strength. Her thoughts felt slow, disconnected, as though she were watching herself from a distance. That was when the black SUV pulled to the curb. It didn't rush in or skid over the snow. It moved carefully, deliberately, coming to a smooth stop near the building's entrance. The engine idled softly, a low, steady sound that stood out against the quiet street. Veronica noticed it only because it stopped. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her 40s. Veronica guessed, dressed in a dark wool coat that fell neatly to her knees. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, practical style, and she moved with a calm assurance that suggested she knew exactly where she was going. She closed the door behind her and scanned the building briefly, her gaze focused, searching. Then her eyes landed on Veronica. "Veronica," the woman called. The sound of her name made Veronica stiffen. Her first instinct was alarm. She straightened, her heart jumping, her mind scrambling to understand how a stranger could possibly know who she was. "Yes," she said cautiously. "Who are you?" The woman's expression softened immediately. She took a few steps closer, stopping at a respectful distance, careful not to crowd her. "My name is Elizabeth Carter," she said. "I was a close friend of your mother's. We went to college together." Veronica frowned, trying to place the name. Her head felt foggy, resistant to memory. My mother never mentioned. I know, Elizabeth said gently. Eleanor wasn't the type to talk much about herself, but she spoke about you, often. Something in the woman's tone, steady, sincere, cut through Veronica's suspicion just enough to give her pause. Elizabeth's eyes moved over her, taking in the pale skin, the tired posture, the backpack resting on the floor. The assessment was quick but thorough, and when her gaze returned to Veronica's face, it carried concern that did not feel performative. You look cold, Elizabeth said, and exhausted. Veronica swallowed. I'm fine. Elizabeth nodded, not arguing. I'm a family law attorney, she continued. Eleanor asked me to check on you if anything ever happened to her. When I couldn't reach you last night, I got worried. Veronica's breath caught. You tried to call? Elizabeth nodded again, several times. The realization hit her all at once, her phone, still locked away inside the apartment. Victor's words echoed in her mind. To prevent trouble. Elizabeth glanced toward the building, then back at Veronica. Can we talk somewhere warmer? Instinct told Veronica to say no, to step back, to protect herself, but exhaustion weighed heavier than caution now. Her legs felt unsteady, her hands numb even inside her gloves. I don't have any money, she said quietly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. And I don't have my phone, or my ID. Elizabeth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I understand. She gestured toward the SUV. Please, just sit inside for a moment. You don't have to decide anything yet. Veronica hesitated, her gaze flicking between the car and the building behind her. The entrance doors loomed, silent and indifferent. She realized, with a dull clarity, that she had nowhere else to go. Her body made the decision before her mind could fully process it. She picked up her backpack and followed Elizabeth to the vehicle. As soon as the door closed behind her, warmth flooded the interior, the heater humming softly. The sudden contrast made her shiver. Elizabeth handed her a bottle of water and a wrapped granola bar from the center console. Slowly, she said, There's no rush. Veronica took them with trembling hands. As she drank, the tension in her shoulders eased slightly for the first time since the night before. Elizabeth watched her quietly, giving her space but staying close. Whatever came next was unclear, but for the first time since the apartment door had closed behind her, Veronica felt something she hadn't felt all night. She was no longer completely alone. The warmth inside the SUV settled slowly into Veronica's bones. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The engine idled quietly, the windows fogging slightly from the contrast between the freezing air outside and the steady heat inside the car. Veronica focused on small things, the feel of the cup in her hands, the steady rhythm of her breathing, as if grounding herself in the present moment. Elizabeth waited until Veronica finished drinking before she spoke again. I'm going to explain a few things, she said carefully. Some of them may be hard to hear, but you deserve the truth. Veronica nodded. Her throat felt tight, but she didn't look away. Your mother came to see me about a year ago, Elizabeth continued. She was worried, not panicked, but alert. Eleanor had a very sharp intuition, even when she tried to ignore it. Veronica's fingers tightened around the cup. Worried about what? About Victor, Elizabeth said plainly. The name landed heavily between them. She didn't have proof, Elizabeth went on. At least not at first. But she felt something was off. Financial pressure, inconsistencies in his stories, the way he handled money. And she was deeply concerned about what might happen to you if anything happened to her. Veronica swallowed. She never said anything to me. I know, Elizabeth said gently. She didn't want to frighten you. Eleanor believed in shielding you from adult burdens as long as she could. Elizabeth reached into her leather briefcase and removed a slim folder. She didn't open it right away. She asked me to prepare several documents, Elizabeth said, just in case. Veronica's eyes dropped to the folder. The first is a notarized will, Elizabeth continued. It clearly states that all of Eleanor's personal assets, including the apartment, are to pass to you. Veronica stared at her. But Victor lied, Elizabeth said calmly. Marriage does not automatically override a will, especially not when the property was owned before the marriage. She paused, letting that sink in. The second document is a temporary guardianship designation, Elizabeth added. Your mother named me as your legal guardian until you turn 18. Veronica's breath caught. You. Elizabeth nodded. It was Eleanor's request. She wanted someone with both legal authority and distance from Victor. Someone who could act quickly. For a moment, Veronica couldn't speak. Her chest ached, not with grief alone, but with something like awe. She planned all of this. Veronica asked quietly. She did, Elizabeth said. She didn't want you to be unprotected. Elizabeth finally opened the folder, revealing copies of the documents inside. Veronica recognized her mother's signature instantly, the same firm, looping script Eleanor had used on school permission slips and birthday cards. Seeing it there nearly undid her. There's more, Elizabeth said, her tone shifting slightly. As I began looking into Victor's background at Eleanor's request, I found patterns. Veronica lifted her eyes. Victor has been married 3 times before, Elizabeth said. All to women older than him. All financially comfortable. Veronica's stomach tightened. The first marriage ended after significant financial losses, Elizabeth continued. The second ended after a severe mental health crisis on the wife's part. The third ended with a sudden cardiac death. Veronica felt cold again despite the heat. Like my mom. I'm not making accusations, Elizabeth said carefully, but the similarities are troubling. Enough that Eleanor wanted everything documented and secured in advance. Veronica leaned back against the seat, her mind racing. Memories replayed themselves through a new lens. Victor's forced concern, his interest in finances, his insistence on managing appointments and paperwork. She knew, Veronica whispered. She knew something could happen. Yes, Elizabeth said softly, and she prepared. Silence filled the car again, heavier this time, but not empty. After a moment, Elizabeth straightened slightly. Now we need to focus on what comes next. Veronica turned toward her, searching her face. First, Elizabeth said, counting on her fingers, we make sure you are safe. You will be staying with me. That's non-negotiable. Veronica nodded, too tired to argue. Second, Elizabeth continued, we recover your identification and personal belongings. Victor had no legal right to confiscate them. And the apartment? Veronica asked. Elizabeth's expression hardened just a fraction. I've already checked. Victor listed the property online last night, within an hour of the funeral. Veronica's breath hitched. We will stop the sale immediately, Elizabeth said. I will file for an emergency injunction today. Any attempt to sell or transfer that property will be frozen until the court reviews the case. And Victor? Veronica asked. That will come, Elizabeth replied. For now, our focus is protecting you and preserving the evidence. Elizabeth closed the folder and placed it back in her bag. Your mother didn't leave you defenseless, she said. She left you allies, protection, and a paper trail. Veronica stared out the window at the snow-covered street. For the first time since Eleanor's death, the chaos of the past 24 hours began to organize itself into something resembling sense. Grief was still there, fear too, but beneath it all, something steadier began to take shape. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She had planned for her survival. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have. Veronica stood beside Elizabeth as the metal doors rose floor by floor, each soft chime tightening the knot in her chest. 2 police officers stood behind them, their posture neutral but alert. At the front was the court officer, a man in his early 50s with a leather folder tucked under his arm, his expression calm and procedural. This time, Veronica was not alone. When the elevator stopped on her floor, the doors slid open to the familiar hallway, the same dim lighting, the same beige walls that had watched her walk out the night before with nothing but a backpack and a shaking body. The memory pressed against her. But Elizabeth's presence anchored her in place. They stopped in front of the apartment door. The court officer stepped forward and rang the bell. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then there were footsteps. Slow, reluctant. The door opened a few inches. Victor Hale stood there, unshaven, his eyes bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled as if he had slept in it. The smug confidence he had worn the night before flickered for a moment, then vanished entirely when he saw the uniforms. "What's this?" he demanded, his gaze darting from the officers to Elizabeth, then landing on Veronica. "What is she doing here?" "Good morning, Mr. Hale," the court officer said evenly. "I'm here on behalf of the Massachusetts Probate and Family Court." Victor scoffed. "This is ridiculous. She left on her own." "That is not what we are here to discuss," the court officer replied. "You are being formally notified of an emergency court order." He opened the folder and held out the document. Victor didn't take it. One of the officers stepped forward. "Sir, I suggest you read it." Victor snatched the paper, scanning it quickly. His face drained of color as his eyes moved down the page. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, looking up. "You can't do this. This order temporarily prohibits any sale, transfer, or modification of the property at this address," the court officer said. "Effective immediately." Elizabeth stepped forward then, her voice calm but firm. "You also forcibly removed a minor from her legal residence during a severe weather emergency, confiscated her identification, and denied her access to shelter." Victor laughed sharply. "That's a lie." "We have statements from neighbors," Elizabeth said, "and a listing time-stamped less than an hour after the funeral." Victor's jaw tightened. "That apartment is mine." "Not according to the will," Elizabeth replied, producing another document. "Nor according to Massachusetts inheritance law." Victor's eyes flicked over the page. His hands trembled. Veronica stood quietly behind Elizabeth, watching the man who had once shared her dinner table unravel piece by piece. "You forged paperwork," Elizabeth continued. "You attempted to sell property you did not legally own, and you illegally evicted a 17-year-old in February." Victor took a step back. "This is harassment." "It's an investigation," one of the officers corrected. "And right now we need you to step aside." The door was opened fully. The apartment looked exactly as Veronica remembered it, too exactly. The coat rack by the door, the framed photos still on the wall, her mother's scarf draped over the chair. The sight made her chest ache, but she kept moving. "Ms. Hayes," the court officer said, turning to her, "you are authorized to retrieve your personal belongings and identification." Veronica nodded, her legs stiff as she crossed the threshold. Victor watched her with open hostility now. "Don't touch anything that's mine." Elizabeth didn't look at him. Everything that belonged to Eleanor is subject to review, and Veronica's personal property is not negotiable. Veronica walked down the hallway toward her room. Each step felt unreal, as if she were moving through someone else's life. Her bedroom door was still closed. She opened it slowly. Nothing had changed. Her bed unmade, her notebooks on the desk, her backpack half empty in the corner. It was as if the night before had been frozen in place. She went straight to the dresser. Her passport was there, her school ID, her phone powered off, Her hands shook as she gathered them. In the living room, raised voices echoed faintly. "You had no right," Elizabeth was saying. "No legal standing whatsoever." "I was her husband," Victor snapped. "And she was not your daughter," Elizabeth replied. "And you knew exactly what you were doing." When Veronica returned to the hallway, phone and documents clutched to her chest, Elizabeth turned toward her immediately. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Veronica nodded. "I have everything." One of the officers stepped closer to Victor. "Sir, we're going to ask you to come with us to answer a few questions." Victor stiffened. "Am I under arrest?" "Not at this moment," the officer said, "but you are required to cooperate." Victor's gaze slid to Veronica, sharp and cold. For a second, the mask slipped completely, revealing something ugly underneath. "This isn't over," he muttered. Elizabeth met his stare without blinking. "For you, it is." Victor was escorted toward the door. As he passed Veronica, she felt a strange absence where fear had been the night before. What remained was exhaustion and resolve. Once the door closed behind him, the apartment seemed to exhale. The court officer turned back to Elizabeth. "We will be sealing the property pending investigation." Elizabeth nodded. "That's appropriate." Technicians arrived shortly after, replacing the locks and placing official seals across the door. Red tape and stamped notices marked the space as untouchable, preserved for scrutiny. Veronica watched as the final seal was pressed into place. This apartment, her mother's home, was no longer a battlefield. It was evidence. As they stepped back into the hallway, Elizabeth rested a hand on Veronica's shoulder. "You did well," she said quietly. Veronica looked once more at the sealed door. Grief still lived there. Memories too. But now, so did justice. And for the first time since the funeral, Veronica felt the ground beneath her begin to hold. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty. Veronica sat at the dining table in Elizabeth's home, her schoolbooks pushed aside to make room for stacks of folders and a single open laptop. Outside, winter had begun to loosen its grip on the city, but inside, time felt suspended, measured instead by documents, phone calls, and careful questions. Elizabeth stood near the window, phone pressed to her ear, her posture straight, her voice controlled. "Yes," she said, "that's correct. No prior cardiac history, active lifestyle, no genetic markers noted in earlier records." She listened, her expression tightening. "I'll need the full toxicology panel," she continued, "and I want the pharmacy records pulled for the past 12 months. She ended the call and turned back toward the table. "They're cooperating," she said, "which tells me they're uneasy." Veronica looked up. "Uneasy about what?" Elizabeth sat across from her, folding her hands. "About the fact that Eleanor's death doesn't align with her medical history." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. "At first glance," Elizabeth continued, "the cause of death looked straightforward. Sudden cardiac failure. It happens, but when we requested her full medical file, several inconsistencies appeared." Veronica felt her chest tighten. "Like what?" "There were no documented complaints," Elizabeth said. "No reports of chronic fatigue, chest pain, shortness of breath. Nothing that would suggest an imminent cardiac event. And yet, the toxicology screening performed after her death showed trace abnormalities." She paused. At the time, they were dismissed as inconclusive. Veronica leaned forward. "But they weren't." "No," Elizabeth said. "They were incomplete." Elizabeth opened a folder and slid a printed report across the table. "Once we petitioned the court and obtained expanded testing authorization, the lab re-examined preserved samples," she explained. "The results show long-term exposure to substances known to weaken cardiac muscle over time. Veronica's fingers trembled as she read. The terminology blurred. But one phrase stood out. Chronic exposure. This wasn't a one-time dose, Elizabeth said quietly. This was gradual. Veronica shook her head. She was healthy. She exercised. She ate well. That's what made it effective, Elizabeth replied. The symptoms mimic natural decline. Fatigue, occasional dizziness. Nothing alarming until it's too late. A memory surfaced in Veronica's mind. Her mother sitting at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples, laughing it off, saying she was just tired. She was taking pills, Veronica said suddenly. She said they were for prevention. Something Victor insisted on. Elizabeth's eyes sharpened. Do you remember the name? No, Veronica admitted. But Victor took her to the appointments. He picked up the prescriptions. That aligns with what we found, Elizabeth said. She pulled up a document on the laptop and turned the screen toward Veronica. A physician named Dr. Martin Keller, she said. Private clinic. Cash-based practice. Minimal digital footprint. Veronica stared at the name. The problem, Elizabeth continued, is that Dr. Keller has no record of treating Eleanor. No appointment logs. No examination notes. Yet multiple prescriptions were issued under his license. Veronica's stomach turned. So he never saw her. No, Elizabeth said. And when investigators contacted him, he admitted to signing off on prescriptions in exchange for payment. He claimed he believed the medications were harmless supplements. Were they? Veronica asked. Elizabeth didn't answer right away. They were not, she said finally. In isolation, the dosages might not raise alarms. But taken consistently over months, they compromise heart tissue. Slowly, quietly. The room felt smaller. So this wasn't an accident, Veronica said, her voice barely audible. It was engineered, Elizabeth replied. Veronica pushed her chair back, standing abruptly. She paced the length of the room, her breath shallow, her hands clenched. All this time, she said, I told myself it was just bad luck. Elizabeth watched her carefully. Denial is a form of protection, she said, especially when the truth is unbearable. Veronica stopped by the window, staring out at the street below. They want to exhume her, Elizabeth said gently. Veronica closed her eyes. The court approved it this morning, Elizabeth continued. It's the only way to confirm the extent of exposure and establish causation beyond doubt. There it was, the line that could not be crossed without consequence. They want to disturb her, Veronica whispered. Elizabeth stood and joined her. They want to give her justice. Veronica pressed her forehead against the glass. Images flooded her mind. Her mother's laugh, her warmth, the way she used to brush Veronica's hair back from her face. I don't want to remember her like this, Veronica said. I know, Elizabeth replied, but this isn't about how you remember her. It's about making sure the truth is recorded so no one can rewrite what happened. Silence stretched between them. After a long moment, Veronica straightened. If I say no, she asked, does it stop? Yes, Elizabeth said. Without your consent, it ends here. Veronica nodded slowly. Then she turned back toward the table. Her eyes clear despite the tears forming. Do it, she said. I don't want comfort built on a lie. Elizabeth placed a hand over hers. That's a brave choice. No, Veronica said quietly. It's the only one my mother would respect. As the paperwork was prepared and signatures gathered, Veronica sat still, feeling the weight of the decision settle into her bones. Grief didn't vanish, but it sharpened, transformed into something steadier. The truth was no longer a threat. It was a promise. The courtroom was quieter than Veronica had expected. Not silent, but restrained, as if everyone present understood that what was unfolding did not require spectacle. The wooden benches creaked softly as people shifted in their seats. Papers rustled. Somewhere behind her, a cough was quickly stifled. Veronica sat in the second row, hands folded in her lap, her back straight. Elizabeth sat beside her, composed as always, a legal pad resting and used on her knee. They had been through months of hearings, motions, expert testimonies, and delays. By now, the ritual of court had become familiar. Still, this moment felt different. Victor Hale sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, his expression unreadable. He no longer looked like the man who had barked orders in the kitchen or shoved a grieving girl into a winter storm. The confidence that once animated him had eroded, replaced by something brittle. The judge entered. Everyone rose. When the proceedings resumed, the prosecutor stood and summarized the case one final time, not with drama, but with precision. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of patience. Evidence was laid out methodically. Financial records showed a pattern of debt and dependency, hidden beneath carefully constructed marriages. Credit lines opened under spouses' names. Assets quietly transferred. Insurance policies adjusted. Beneficiaries reassigned. Then came the medical testimony. A cardiologist explained how the substances found in Eleanor Hayes's system weakened heart tissue over time, mimicking natural cardiac decline. A toxicologist confirmed the dosage pattern, small enough to evade detection, consistent enough to cause irreversible damage. A forensic pathologist testified that the same substances had been found posthumously in preserved samples from one of Victor's previous wives. The courtroom listened as the pattern came into focus. 3 marriages, 3 women with assets, 3 unexplained medical collapses, and 1 man who benefited every time. The fraudulent physician testified next. He spoke nervously, admitting to signing prescriptions without examinations, to accepting cash, to trusting Victor's assurances that the medications were benign supplements. "I was wrong," he said, his voice shaking, "and I regret it every day." The defense attempted to frame Victor as careless, not malicious. They argued that intent could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt. That negligence was not murder. The prosecution responded calmly. Intent, they argued, was not only proven, it was documented. In messages, in financial timing, in the calculated escalation of dosages, in the attempted sale of Eleanor's apartment within hours of her death. Finally, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The wait lasted 2 days. When they returned, the air in the courtroom felt heavier, denser with anticipation. Veronica focused on her breathing, keeping her gaze fixed ahead. The foreperson stood. On counts of financial fraud, guilty. On counts of document forgery, guilty. On counts of illegal eviction of a minor, guilty. And on the charge of second-degree murder, guilty. Veronica did not flinch. There was no surge of emotion, no rush of relief, just a quiet certainty settling into place. Like the final piece of a long, painful puzzle, Victor's shoulders sagged. His attorney leaned in to whisper something, but Victor didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, as if the words had passed through him without landing. Sentencing followed weeks later. The judge spoke plainly. This court finds that the defendant engaged in a sustained pattern of manipulation, exploitation, and calculated harm, she said. The victim's death was not an accident. It was the foreseeable outcome of deliberate actions. She paused. For the charge of second-degree murder, the defendant is hereby sentenced to 30 years in state prison. This sentence will be served without eligibility for early parole. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Victor was led away without protest. Veronica watched him go, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a sense of closure she had not known was possible. It was over. Outside the courthouse, the sky was pale and clear. Spring had begun to assert itself, tentative but real. Elizabeth stood beside Veronica on the stone steps. the noise of the city flowing around them. "Are you okay?" Elizabeth asked. Veronica nodded slowly. "I think so." Elizabeth studied her for a moment. "You don't have to feel anything specific," she said. "There's no right reaction to justice." Veronica looked back at the courthouse doors. "It doesn't feel like a victory," she said. "It just feels finished." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "That's often what real justice feels like." As they walked away, Veronica felt the weight she had been carrying for months begin to lift. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had been acknowledged, recorded, and answered. Justice hadn't shouted. It had simply arrived and stayed. Time did not heal everything, but it changed the shape of the pain. The months after the trial passed quietly. There were no headlines, no interviews, no public reckoning beyond the courtroom walls. Life resumed its ordinary rhythms, marked not by dramatic turns, but by routines that slowly stitched stability back into Veronica's days. She lived with Elizabeth. At first, it felt temporary, like a pause between disasters. A guest room, borrowed space, careful politeness. Veronica kept her belongings neatly arranged, as if ready to leave at any moment. But weeks turned into months, and something steadier took root. They ate dinner together most evenings. Elizabeth cooked simply, efficiently, never asking too many questions. Veronica learned her habits, the way she reviewed case files late at night, the quiet mornings with coffee and news radio, the discipline that structured her life without suffocating it. There were rules, but they were gentle ones, curfews that made sense, expectations clearly stated, protection without control. For the first time since her mother's death, Veronica slept without listening for footsteps. She returned to school in the spring. The hallways felt unfamiliar at first, populated by conversations that seemed strangely distant from everything she had lived through. But her teachers were patient, her classmates cautious, unsure of what to say. Over time, normalcy reclaimed its place, not because the past had faded, but because Veronica had learned how to carry it without being crushed. She graduated high school with quiet determination. College came next. Elizabeth never pushed, never steered Veronica toward any particular future. But as court transcripts and legal briefs had once filled the dining table, something had shifted inside Veronica. She had watched the law not as an abstract system, but as a shield, something that could be wielded carefully, deliberately, to protect those who could not protect themselves. When she told Elizabeth she wanted to study law, there was no surprise in her response. "I thought you might," Elizabeth said simply. They visited Eleanor's apartment together one afternoon that summer. Legally, it had been returned to Veronica months earlier. The seals were removed, the locks replaced, everything restored on paper, but the apartment itself remained untouched. Dust clung lightly to surfaces. Sunlight filtered through the windows in familiar patterns. Eleanor's presence lingered, not as something painful, but as something intact. Veronica walked through each room slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't rush. "This can wait," she said eventually. Elizabeth nodded. "There's no timeline for reclaiming a space like this." They decided to rent it out temporarily. The income would support Veronica's education. The apartment would remain preserved, waiting until the day she was ready. Years passed. Veronica grew into adulthood not abruptly, but deliberately. She studied late. She worked part-time. She learned the weight of responsibility and the value of restraint. Loss had shaped her, but it had not hardened her. She learned to trust again. Elizabeth remained a constant, not a replacement for Eleanor, but something different. A presence earned through choice, not obligation. Over time, the word guardian faded, replaced by something unspoken and more durable. Family, in its quietest form. On the morning of her graduation from law school, Veronica stood in front of the mirror adjusting her robe. her reflection unfamiliar and unmistakably her own. The past no longer dominated the image, but it had not disappeared. Elizabeth waited in the living room, holding a small bouquet of white flowers. "You're ready," she said. The ceremony was long, formal, filled with applause that felt distant and symbolic. When Veronica's name was called, she walked across the stage with steady steps, her expression composed. She didn't look for Victor. She didn't think about the trial. She thought about her mother. Later that afternoon, she drove alone to the cemetery. The sky was clear. Summer light filtered gently through the trees. Eleanor's grave was neat, the stone simple and well kept. Veronica knelt, placing the flowers at its base. "I made it," she said softly. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, just acknowledgement. "I know you planned for me," she continued, "even when I didn't understand, even when it hurt." She sat there for a long time, remembering small things, the way Eleanor used to hum while cooking, the notes she left on the fridge, the quiet confidence with which she moved through the world. Strength, Veronica realized, did not always announce itself. Sometimes it worked in advance. When she stood to leave, she felt no need to say goodbye. Some legacies did not require words. As Veronica walked back to her car, she understood something she had learned too early, but would carry for the rest of her life. Healing did not mean forgetting. Justice did not mean bitterness. Protection did not mean fear. Her life had been shaped by loss, but also by foresight, by care, by a mother who had refused to leave her unguarded. And that quiet legacy remained, unbroken,